Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. The Indian subcontinent has been buzzing since the Leaders Level Summit of the G20 that was held in New Delhi on 9th and 10th September 2023. The Delhi Declaration that was released during the summit recognized 10 prominent themes, which can be seen as the key agenda of global governance for the coming years. The summit recorded a watershed moment as it expanded to include the African Union, making the forum more inclusive and more representative of the global south. Today joining me are three experts who have been following the G20 and India's presidency. They will help us in deconstructing India's presidency, the significance of its outcomes, and most importantly, the future of not just the G20, but the agenda set by India in its presidency. I have with me Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevea, Director of ISAS, Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, and Dr Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead at ISAS. Welcome.
Thank you, Devyani.
The three of you have recently edited a book titled India and the Future of G20, Shaping Policies for a Better World, which examines the G20 as India takes the reins during a critical juncture in history. The book showcases a diverse array of rich insights and perspectives from distinguished scholars, policy practitioners, and G20 member Sherpas, with focus on key themes such as digital economy, resilient supply chains, environmental standards, climate finance, gender empowerment, and the future of multilateralism, offering a comprehensive examination of G20's impact on the world stage. Now, what India's G20 presidency has ended, this book would provide a thought-provoking narrative that will be invaluable to policymakers, strategic experts, and the business community worldwide. So let's begin with the podcast now. My first question is, what is the G20 and how relevant is it to the global system? What was the context in which India took over the presidency, the geopolitical, economic, as well as climate-focused action? And what is your opinion of the importance of it?
That was quite a remarkable context that you set out, Devyani, I think, for the G20 as such, because this is in a broader perspective with respect to the publication that you mentioned, and also the Delhi Declaration that was presented a couple of weeks ago, and the conditions that prevail externally for the G20 members and even internally as well. India's G20 presidency is contextually quite unique. The presidency continues to remain there, though officially the baton has been passed on to the next presidency. Till the 30th of November, India will continue to hold the presidency, and it is interesting to note that the Indian Prime Minister has mentioned the organization of a virtual summit, which will take a look at the action taken on the various policies that have been announced in the Delhi Declaration. So very specifically, this particular presidency, till the time the declaration came, was actually suffering from a lack of credibility. And that lack of credibility was not attributable to the president member or any of the individual members, but it was simply because of the conditions that prevailed. Primarily the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and also because of the major power competition. And during the engagements that followed since last December, there were a variety of reports that the G7 and the rest of the G20 members were not seeing eye to eye with each other on a large number of subjects. So all these were actually hitting the credibility of the G20 process, because the G20 by itself is a very heterogeneous group. It comprises the world's topmost economies, along with a large number of emerging market economies, and it comprises countries which are heavily populated, which are not so populated, but all of them were trying to reach a consensus on the major global economic issues, which included reforming multilateral financial institutions, achieving a platform and a strategy for making climate finance affordable for most countries of the world, trying to make digital public infrastructure a broader space where a lot of the emerging markets that are G20 members can come and participate and ensure that public goods are delivered much more effectively to their people. And in all this, India was kind of bringing in its own practices and experiences to ensure that there is an inclusive uptake of the suggestions that were offered. But because of the shadow of the conflict that hung very heavily. And because of the dispute over the kind of language that can be used in their declaration, which would actually yield a consensus, which appeared very, very difficult, even during the time when the summit began, there was eventually, I think, a big sigh of relief that was heaved by the global community, including India, and that was probably India's major diplomatic achievement in getting a declaration through, which eventually had the consensus of all G20 members. That was one. The second is that on some of the issues that we consider important for the world at large, which have been reflected and deliberated upon in the publication that you have alluded to, subjects like the climate finance and climate change, sustainable development goals, women's empowerment, environmental sustainability and corporate governance, so on and so forth. All these have been provided with some specific policy direction in the G20 declaration. So that is how I would look at the broader, bigger achievement of the G20 process. The G20 continues to live and move on to the next presidency, and with it take the spirit of the elements that have been declared out of consensus in the last summit.
Yeah, just to develop slightly on that as well, you asked about the context and you asked about looking ahead, how significant this will be. I guess in this way, it'd be also important to look at how the G20 emerged and how it's evolved over time as well. The G20 evolved out of the economic crisis of the late 1990s, primarily often described as the Asian economic crisis, but it had an impact way beyond Asia as well. And in that context, there was a sense that there was a need for a broader international, multilateral, intergovernmental forum that would bring developing countries on to the table as well, but also bring some of the larger economies beyond the G7 itself. And so the G20 emerged as a meeting of central bankers and finance ministers. But after the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, the G20 evolved even further into a leader-level summit. And the whole idea was to have a sort of a forum in which one could coordinate policies and strategies. And it was seen to be successful in that sense. And I start with that because I think it's important to approach the G20 as a sort of a crisis response sort of a forum. And Amitendu very rightly noted the crises that we are facing today. And so the G20 in India took place in a particular context and particular series of crises that while they came to the fore as Russia invaded Ukraine, the questions over the future of multilateralism have been around for some time. So this is a culmination of longer issues about the future of multilateralism, but also the shape of the financial architectures that they are. And we know that much of the developing world is grappling with debt, and these have been accentuated by the post-COVID challenges that they are confronting as well. So it's important to see that the G20 has responded to crises, and now the question is, how is it going to respond to the current crises as well?
Taking over from what Iqbal just mentioned, see, the challenges before the G20 and this meeting were territorial, strategic, economic, and others. But I think the significant achievement has been that the Indian presidency has been able to give it some direction, give it some focus over some issues which confront the countries today. And those have gone into detailed discussion, and I think we can bring them out slowly. Issues, like women's-led development, climate financing, or multilateral development institutions being reworked, etc., are issues which have a focus, which have a roadmap, and I think that's a benefit emerging out of this meeting.
I think one of the key points that have come out in your initial answers and responses to my question has been on consensus building, credibility, as well as the focus or a multi-pronged approach to Indian presidency. So further building on that, my question would be that how do you view that India was able to build the kind of credibility it did in the presidency and come out with the Delhi Declaration, which had not just 83 paragraphs but was approved by all the member countries? And what were some of your key takeaways from the document, and what are some of the key wins that we see in current times?
See, the good thing that happened for the Delhi Declaration was that India worked very closely with the previous president, which was Indonesia, and the future, which was going to be Brazil. And the three countries worked together to ensure that there is a consensus which is built up among the countries, considering the challenges and the two guiding features were, number one, that they decided that it was more to be focused on economic issues, not so much on strategy and geopolitical kind of tensions which were prevailing. And number two, that the document that they create should be a forward-looking document. It was useless for them to, take on the issues that were, that the world was struggling with, but point towards a forward-looking document. And I think keeping this as the base, the document that emerged, which brought about consensus with all the nations which were participating, was indeed a very well-focused document, and all the countries have contributed to it and find that their interests, their concerns have been taken care of.
I would agree with the thought that Mr. Rai expressed, in the sense that this eventually turned out to be a teamwork, as the Indian Sherpa pointed out, that a combination of efforts between the Indonesian, Indian, Brazilian, and also probably the South African and the Saudi Arabian Sherpas coming into the story. See, it also reflects upon the fact that to a very large extent, the declaration had tried to incorporate the concerns of the emerging markets, which in a sense also represents the concerns of the Global South. And the Global South theme was a strongly resonating theme in the presidency, and not just in this presidency. It began from the earlier one, and it will continue to go on, because there is a succession of the representatives of the Global South from among the G20 family who are going to hold the presidency. So it was important to make this particular declaration not only see the light of the day as a consensus document, but also be a document which will be able to provide a continuity as the presidencies pass from one member to that of the other. So I think that is where ultimately that teamwork and a vision towards the future made a lot of difference.
Yeah, to develop on that, the G20 does not have a permanent secretariat. So the agenda of every meeting is set by the country that's hosting it. And in this case, we saw very clearly how India built on the agenda that had been set by Indonesia. And it also incorporated the views of countries that are not part of the G20 as well. Upon assuming the presidency, Prime Minister Modi was very clear in stating that India would not only form its agenda on the basis of the countries that are part of the G20, but also take on the views of fellow travelers, as he termed it, from the Global South and the developing world. So in this sense, there was a broadening of the agenda to bringing in new areas of focus that maybe traditionally were not there prior to Indonesia's hosting as well. But the other thing we see is, given the sort of geopolitical, geo-economic crisis in the world, there was a number of countries that are part of the G20 were invested in actually making it a success, in coming to a compromise as well. And of course, we have to also acknowledge that a lot of diplomatic negotiation work went into this shaping of the Delhi Declaration as well. And one of the takeaways that we can, there are multiple takeaways, but one of those that we can keep an eye on looking ahead is the fact that the African Union, there's agreement to include it in the G20, making it the G21 in that sense. And this is something that there has been general broad consensus on. Even Indonesia had put it on the agenda as well. But India had really benchmarked this as a thing that they wanted to get out of this meeting as well. And we can see how there was consensus that built around this as well.
Thank you. So I think we realized that there is a lot of focus on finance and there were certain reforms introduced in terms of taxation, in terms of multinational development banks. There was also a lot of focus on the global south. I think my question subsequently would be that to what degree, I mean, for a long time we have seen that the North Atlantic region has shaped how global governance will be disbursed for a really long time. And I think with subsequent presidencies from actually not geographically, but the global south, as we may call it, the developing world, will shape significantly how we look at global governance. So in that light, how do you see the initial emphasis that was placed by India on global south and representing its values and concerns at the G20? To what degree do you think that subsequent presidencies by Brazil and South Africa would shape the G20, and what impact can it possibly have, whether it would make it more inclusive, whether it is still rhetorical and a lot of work is required? To what degree in the balance sheet would you sort of look at this move, and if you could give a more forward-looking approach to the presidency?
Thank you, Devyani. I think I would very easily answer to this question by saying that a large part of what you have asked can be found in the book that we have prepared from our side. And I also take this opportunity to officially acknowledge the very important role that you have played in the book. And we deeply appreciate from all of our editors. But to come to the point, I think the G20, in a sense, represents a very unique forum. In today's world, when we look at quote-unquote influences that go into the making of policies and regulations, there are known influences that we identify. Let's say, for example, there is the Brussels effect, which is typically the European Union. There's the Washington effect, which comes from the North American side. And there's also a Beijing effect, which is being talked about in a larger perspective. The G20 ultimately has to steer clear of all these three effects and maybe more potential ones, because it is a collective effort which represents nearly 90% of the world economy, both in terms of output, more than 3/4 of the global population, a huge amount of global trade in services and goods, and obviously in terms of everything else, investments, ideas, intellectual property, knowledge capital. And by that account, the G20 or G21, as Iqbal mentioned now, also accounts for a very significant part of what the world is facing today in terms of challenges. So there cannot be a single attitude, a single ideology to a particular problem which can determine the G20's way forward. It has to be a combination of all these approaches, and that is where I think the point that you raised with respect to whether there would be a persistence of the North American Treaty Organization alliances perspective on major global issues, or whether that will be countered by other perspectives. That possibility always exists in a territorial space. But I think the G20 is unique in the sense that the G20 will need to take all these approaches as mutually complementary. They might be competitive in many other respects, but from a G20 perspective, they need to be mutually complementary, brought together to yield constructive solutions. And to some extent, the Delhi Declaration has probably succeeded in achieving that, because when we look at the substantive outcomes that have been expressed with, you mentioned 83 paragraphs. 83 paragraphs simply because a lot of the consultation that has taken place in the G20 tracks have actually been reflected in that declaration, which is unique in its own way. So there is clearly this view, which has been to a very large extent enabled by India and other presidencies, to ensure that a lot of the thought gets to figure in the declaration. And that's the way the G20 would want to go forward, in a collective and inclusive fashion.
Clearly, post the NATO or even the G7, the G20 has been able to achieve the fact that the global south, the emerging markets, the emerging economies have got a focus now. Leadership of these countries has been established. And the fact that the African Union was made to join in, or was invited to join in, has given it a much broader perspective. But the more important thing is the focus that it has brought about. For example, we talked about climate finance, which is one of the very major burning things as far as nations go today. Now, the Paris Declaration of $100 billion being raised annually has gotten nowhere. But the present meeting could at the least ensure that if the work schedule of the World Bank kind of multilateral development institutes is reworked and refocused to ensure that priority issues such as debt relief for the countries which are going to suffer from the climate action problems will get a focus. Now, earlier it was just the World Bank was focused on removing poverty, was sharing prosperity. But now it is a question of climate change and its vulnerabilities have also been added. Towards that extent, I think it has succeeded in ensuring that unlike other organizations, we focus along a roadmap which has an activity attached to it.
Devyani, you started the podcast by asking about what the G20 is, and I think it's when we look ahead to how the G20 is whether it's been successful and what the future is, we again have to look at what it actually is. It was established as a forum to coordinate policy, coordinate approaches and strategies. And in this sense, you have to locate it within other multilateral forums in the world as well. So it's not a standalone in that sense. So it's able to push the agenda to an extent, but this agenda needs to be taken up by other forums as well. So, for instance, Mr. Rai mentioned the issue of climate finance. This is something that will be up for discussion again in November when the COP meets again. So we need to actually locate it within the broader framework of multilateral and intergovernmental organizations that are going on. The other thing, when we talk about the Global South, it's interesting to see how the language or the discourse of the Global South has in a sense re-emerged. This term is not new. In the 1960s, there was a concerted attempt by some countries, in fact 70-odd countries within the United Nations, to come together to push a particular agenda to voting. But what they found was, while they could put their own differences apart, the vote in the United Nations did not necessarily impact policy because they could be out-muscled financially, geopolitically by the developed world. So in this sense, the return of this discourse is interesting to see. But we should also be very, very clear about the fact that the Global South is not a homogeneous unit. Economically, they are at different positions, they have different priorities, etc. So it remains to be seen how far this agenda can push in a united way. But having said that, we should also recognize that India took over the G20's presidency from Indonesia. It's handing it over to Brazil, or has already handed over. And then from Brazil, it will move to South Africa. So we have a very interesting historical juncture in which 4 countries from the Global South will be shaping the agenda to take forward. And they each seem to be looking at what the other is doing. So I think it's interesting times ahead in this sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights. I think we are at a junction where India has ended its presidency, and just as you mentioned, the different complexities, opportunities and challenges it poses, I think what we also should take note of is that the Delhi Declaration, while as much as it may be a success, it's important for us to see as it will unravel whether it is a self-implementing document as well or not. So with that, I would like to thank you again for joining us today. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.